Okay, thanks everybody. So moving into our next panel session, and this one follows on really nicely from the session we just had on using data to improve procurement processes, because this is all about getting the right data to drive value from government spending. So the UK government departments spend more than £1 trillion in total every year. So anything that we can do to kind of make the better use of that spending, even a tiny percentage of that spending, could have huge benefits for the government, but also for delivery of public services. So in this session, we're going to look at kind of data and how data can be used to evaluate the efficiency of that spending and look at what data and information is required to measure the impact of spend and how public sector organisations, as we've been doing for all of the morning so far, how they can work better together to kind of identify the data they need and share the data they need and share good practice. We have a really brilliant panel with us here today. So as I've said for all of them, once we hear from our speakers, please do put any questions that you have to our panel. They are here for you to answer your questions. So we have Catherine Hutchinson, who is head of the Evaluation Task Force in the Cabinet Office and HM Treasury, so a joint task force. We have Fiona James, who is Chief Digital Officer and Director for the Data Growth Office at National Statistics. And then we have, really pleased, because she's come a long way for this, so you really need to make use of Tuula. We've got Tuula Lybeck, who is the Project Director, Development and Digitalization Project of the Discretionary Government Grants, all the way from the Ministry of Finance in Finland for us today. Great to have you with us, Tuula. And we have Richard Price, who is Director General for Performance, Strategy and Analysis at the Ministry of Justice. And then we have Sian Thomas, who is the Chief Data Officer at the Department for Business and Trade. So it really is a stellar panel. As I say, please do take this opportunity to put your questions. Catherine, I'm going to ask you to kick off with some opening remarks.
I was trying to work out if I was going to be first or last, but okay, I'll go with first. So yeah, as I've just been introduced, my name's Catherine, and I am the head of a joint Cabinet Office Treasury task force that's been set up essentially to make sure that the over £1 trillion a year the government spends is actually having the impact we hope it will. And it's funny actually because, to be honest, when I explain my job to most people, they sort of assume that happens naturally in government, and it's quite embarrassing to have to explain that it really doesn't. And that actually we take for granted the approach that we take in things like medicine, where you would test and trial a new drug before you would take it, and we just don't apply that same sort of approach to social policy. Like, we're very happy to roll out a new system of benefits or a new education program without the same level of rigor as we would apply to medicines we take. And that isn't acceptable for government anymore, and that's why the task force is trying to introduce these sorts of approaches. So for me, data means much more than just a number in a spreadsheet. It means sort of insights, it means the information, it means the intelligence that we can use to be able to really, in a sophisticated way, make sure that every pound the government has is spent most effectively. So there are three elements to that. There are the structures. So actually, what are the processes, what are the systems that we have that actually help us use data? So we're setting up an evaluation registry. It's unbelievable that in other ways that we wouldn't know exactly what we've already learned before, but we don't. I had to Google things that I've worked on myself. That actually, so structures, then the sort of the substance. So it's the quality of the stuff. There's so much data and information produced, but actually, what are we using it for? Actually, how useful is it? Is it of the right quality to tell us anything? Lots of people love to stare at a dashboard, or they love to look at a spreadsheet, but really, what is it saying? If I tell you now that 32% of people enjoyed this talk, is that high? Is that low? So what? And that's the third thing, so what? So is the stuff that we're collecting, is the information we're using, are the evaluations that we're using to actually understand the impact, is it in the areas that matter? Is it actually in the marginal decisions? Is there something that's truly informing the debate? So in government, we need to do better to understand, to harness data, to be able to make truly informed decisions. We need to make those systems and structures in place so it's actually second nature to us and we have stuff that's easily available. We have to make sure that the stuff we're using is good quality, and then we have to make sure that it's relevant. So for me, the purpose of the task force is that evidence base goes into spending choices, so the best available evidence is available at those key moments, but it's only really going to matter if all those three elements are in place.
Great, thank you. Again, a really nice way to set the scene, because I think what you said there about don't make assumptions that it is being measured, that somebody is doing the evaluation, really a key point to make there, I think, and having that same rigor across kind of social policy areas as you would expect from other policy areas as well. And then I love the way you phrase it there, is that we're generating loads of data in a lot of areas, but is it the right kind of data? Is it useful? And so what? What are you doing it for? So you need to understand your questions as well. What are you asking? So some really good things there to be thinking about. And over to you, Fiona, for your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think just picking up on that theme around the right data, we do need to identify and agree what the kind of critical data, the essential shared data assets are across government, because there are key data sets which are foundational in terms of both service provision and also analysis. So we might look at mobility data, for example. We would look at benefits and income data. We might look at card transaction data. Those have high analytical value, and we need to we quickly need to move to agreeing those and getting them used and in use across government with the relevant standards associated with them. The right data, I think, also means identifying, and each of us playing a role where we've got a data gap, particularly to make us more inclusive. So, we have a role to represent everyone in society, and, you will be well placed to identify where our data doesn't represent everyone in society. So, for example, there's some really great work going on between Home Office, DWP and ONS around refugee integration outcomes at the moment, and how the 115,000 refugees who are in England and Wales are currently accessing services, and what kind of support and outcomes they end up with at the moment. So I think that getting the right data is, absolutely fundamental. And then how do we drive value from data? Well, I suspect there's been a lot of discussion this morning around where there are pain points in the system. We have an ad hoc siloed approach to data linkage at the moment. So one of the products that ONS is building, well, it's a set of data products actually. It's going to support more consistent, easier linkage of data. It's called the Reference Data Management Framework. I'm not sure if it's come up already, but it's based on a series of indexes, and it will help us more consistently bring data together. So finding ways of getting higher quality, better matching in more consistent approaches will go a long way. I think the pace at which artificial intelligence has emerged should also play a significant role here. It has massive opportunity to drive efficiencies into the system, but obviously we have to use it in a really safe and ethical way. And we've been having a lot of internal discussion around kind of coordination, and how we kind of move that into implementation. And then I think there's just like the cost of what we're spending on data. Do you know, for example, in your department, how much your department is spending on data? How much of that is direct to commercial? How much of that is your department paying another department to pick up kind of engineering costs, for example? Yeah. I think where we're putting forward business cases and where we've got programs that are dealing with data, let's make sure that those business cases include the costs of getting those foundational data aspects right, and making sure that we invest in that now.
Thanks, Fiona. So agree on the key data sets. That should be something that could be done relatively easily, I think, but also identify then the data gaps that we have. And very important that you mentioned there that we should be aware of whether we have the data to evaluate everybody, so whether it's inclusive, whether we know where we're not measuring and who we're not measuring as well. And then it's great to hear that example you say from the ONS of where you're creating this reference data management framework, which would help with the data linking, because one of the things that's come up is how do you actually help data sharing? How do you actually get that done in practice? And other issues around the costs of data, which I think we will be touching on as well in other presentations. Thank you so much, Fiona. Tuula, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. And what a weather you have here. It's so lovely.
We didn't have summer, so we're getting it now. So it wasn't always like this.
Yes, in Finland we are waiting for the snow. Yes. I have been a civil servant all my career, and I chose this career because I want to change society better. And it is only 10 years I have, when I noticed that I have to deal with data. And I put some words to the framework how I think about data, how you make savings. That's I'm working now in Ministry of Finance, and we are thinking about these things every day. And this framework, we have 4 boxes, and I think we have, it is really we are struggling with the same issues, really. We are living in the same world. So these 2 boxes left, I think they are dealing with technical issues, data quality and open data. And these 2, right, I think that they are dealing with people, with human. And for me, we have struggled with these things. It's hard work to get data better quality and open the data with ethics. And I'm a lawyer, and for me, data protection is very important. But I think that the trust in society for citizens, it's so important to open the public data. Actually, in the morning when Mr. Simon Case talked about this, some kind of thought that everybody should have skills. That's in the other sides, I talk about that later, but I also thought about AI, because we have struggled so many years with this glossary and terminology and everything. And for instance, in Finland, we have for word snow, maybe 50 different words and that kind of things. Maybe this data quality issue will be solved after we have learned about the AI. But nowadays we have to have quite structured data if we want to use it cross-governmentally and so on. But yes, a few words also about these new skills. For us now, the most difficult question is how to motivate people to use data and learn these new skills. Because we are in data faith, everybody, I think, but we have to give this message for our colleagues, people who don't work with data, but it belongs to everybody's work table nowadays. And the first of all, data management, we have to have leaders, politicians to manage this process. Without that, it's impossible. And here is, I don't read them, but for us in my project, it's very painful, first of all, find the metrics, and people own their own things. If you have data, you may be afraid that things change. We are dealing with discretionary grants, and we are going on. I don't know if we succeed, but anyways, we are digitalizing all the process, so we are getting the savings in ICT and staff costs So,
Brilliant. Thanks.
but the most important is people.
Yeah, thanks Tuula. I think that comes up quite a lot, that when we're talking about data, there's the technical things that need to be done, but actually a lot more of it is about people and culture and changing the way people do things. I think a lot of people will resonate certainly with, they've been in the civil service a long time, as you said, that it's only really in the last 10 years that you're thinking about data in this way and that it's becoming part of everything. So that's a change for a lot of people, I think, that we need to recognise as well. And then what you said there about kind of how do you motivate officials and leaders, because it goes back, I think, to what you were both saying, is don't assume someone else is doing this to your policy area. It might be you that has to put this work in, and maybe breaking out some of those fears around sharing their data with other people. Thanks, Tuula, for all of that. Richard, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm Richard Price. I'm the Director General at the Ministry of Justice, and my area covers, data, digital analysis, strategy, a whole bunch of other things. And I sit on something called the Criminal Justice Action Group, which tries to bring together the many disparate agencies across the criminal justice system to focus on the things that really matter to the public. So delivering justice, protecting the public, getting crime down. And we spend, I haven't got the exact numbers, several billions, as you can imagine, across the whole system a year in achieving this. Data are really fundamental to the way we think about the system, but there are real barriers, long-standing barriers, in the way we can use and exploit data to give us better insights into the way we're delivering services for the public. We have a whole series of agencies, very disparate agencies, many of them operationally and indeed constitutionally independent of one another. This does not bode well, right, in terms of helping people to collaborate. So what are we doing? Well, I suppose we have three sorts of challenges that we're focusing on through our data programs. One is making sure that we are able to pool data in a way which gets strategic analysis and insight to people taking strategic decisions across the system, whether it's nationally or at a local level through our criminal justice action boards. So if you are a chief constable or a police and crime commissioner sitting locally, well, at the moment, you have some quite good data dashboards which pool the statistics on outcomes. You will not have good insights into what the management data are telling you, because each agency has data which are organised differently on different systems which can't talk to each other, and very often will define basic things like offenders, victims, cases totally differently. So we have quite a challenge there, but the key thing is to make sure that we have a coherent view across the system and we can put that into the hands of people taking those decisions. Second thing, we need to get operational data to the front line so people can take empowered decisions about, say, the offender in front of them or the victim that they're looking after, and they've got a much better holistic understanding of what that person's experience has been, what their experience has been as they've come through the system, and maybe what other experiences they've had of other public services. What's their educational situation? Do they have learning difficulties? Do they have, what's their situation with regard to housing and health? If you don't have those things, it's really hard to package together support which either helps somebody to turn away from offending or reduce their offending behaviour, or looks after them as a victim. So again, we're trying to make sure that we have linked data which we can put into the hands of people and don't leave us in a situation where, at the moment, if you're a probation officer, you maybe have to work solidly for 4, 5, 6 weeks just to get the data from the criminal justice system on the individual you're working with. Third thing is pooling data for research, whether that's research within the system or opening it up through a secure, anonymized platform to outside researchers. We like to think we have a monopoly on wisdom, of course, in government. We don't, folks. So the more we can make data available both transparently to the public, but also on secure data systems, so researchers can come in, they will tell us things about our own data using our own systems that we won't have thought of. And when we're trying to understand the efficacy of what we're doing, how we're spending money, how effective it is, that's critical. So just to wrap up, what are we doing? We have a series of data programs, which I can say a bit more about, which are linking the data, joining together both public data and administrative data sets and operational data across the system, and secondly, trying to put those in the hands of decision makers. Thirdly, really trying to draw all that together so we have a better understanding both of the services we're providing and of really critically of what their users need. And finally, drawing all that together so we just do evaluation better. We've got a better sense of how we can improve value for money, both in delivering better services and in avoiding waste and inefficiency.
Thank you so much, Richard. I mean, there is so much. I'm going to come back to some of this when we come to the questions, but so much to unpick there about we've already talked about the challenges of sharing data across central government departments. When you look out to kind of your delivery landscape, what are the practical issues around doing that? And I think we've got somebody from Wandsworth. I don't know if they're still in this, here. So I might ask your reflections on this again, but kind of the reality of that. And then interesting as well what you said there about people are scared of sharing the data sometimes with the private sector. We haven't even talked about with academia, which you've brought in there, sharing data with academics as well. So thanks, lots of things to think about there. Sian, your thoughts?
So in the Department for Business and Trade, we do quite a lot of work on our data platform. And the data platform supports, in theory, all of the data for the department, which actually puts us in a really good position when we look at monitoring and evaluation, because you wouldn't always know what might be there in a department, and I think that really helps. But I'm going to go back a little bit and start off telling you about a case study from the Food Standards Agency where I was previously. The Food Hygiene Rating Scheme, you'll all know it, is the green stickers in the windows of food businesses. We did a really significant evaluation to look at whether that had an impact on public health, and we could quantify the number of people who didn't get foodborne illness because the scheme actually improved food hygiene in communities. It's a really nice study, and it showed me how important evaluation of policy was. So that's where I got my interest in the area, and then I've taken that to the Department for Business and Trade, and we actually have a really small evaluation team in DDA. So all of the digital and data products and services in the department get the same kind of scrutiny as something that was bidding for money from Treasury would get. That means that we can see how well things work, and it's quite surprising. Value for money in things that you really wouldn't expect to be high because they're quite basic are actually really quite significant. In fact, I would say that one of the biggest learnings for me has been the simpler it is, the more likely it is to be valuable. But it also means we can share that across the department, and so the monitoring and evaluation teams have access to that data and those tools to do more sophisticated analysis without having to worry about where to get the data. And I think that's a real step change. But when you follow that through, it actually takes us to a different kind of problem, and that is how government quantifies value for money and how the Green Book works. And I think it's really sad that in 2023 we're still in a position where the cost of buying a new digital or data service is linked to the cost of the new service and doesn't recognise that a significant chunk of the cost, dare I say the majority of the cost, is actually how to get the data out of the old systems and services. And this really comes back to the things in the first session about legacy tech, right? If you can't afford to move away from your legacy tech, you're actually storing up even bigger problems for the future, because the longer you leave it, the greater the cost of the new service will be, because the cost isn't the new service. The new service is going to be incredibly cheap. The cost is the legacy tech. So we need to change our mindset, I think, in government. And even if we don't change the Green Book, we need to think about how to change people's thought processes so they associate moving data and taking data out of legacy systems and putting it in places where it can be used as a benefit and not something that impacts the bottom line. And if you take that a step further, I wonder how some of the old programs that have never seen the light of an efficiency or evaluation piece of work would fare up in comparison with some of the new programs.
So really, I like the example you gave about the food hygiene standards. I think that's really nice. You can visualize that and see the impact of it. But great what you're saying there about kind of how the government quantifies value for money and building in that cost of moving over the data onto new systems, because I think that's definitely one of the things that's going to be an obstacle to this going forward. So I think if we're talking about how do you make this happen, those kind of things have to be recognised, and we have to have a kind of consistent and agreed approach on those going forward. Quite complicated. I think then people might be mulling that over what you've just said and maybe might have some questions about that. But I just want to kick the conversation off. So I am going to come, thank you all of you for your great opening comments. I'm going to come, we've got half an hour now for questions from the audience. I wanted just to pick up a couple of things myself. So one of the things that you mentioned, I think, Jane, this was you, Fiona, this was you who mentioned this, was the ethics of AI, I think you mentioned. And I wonder whether the kind of not understanding, or maybe a fear from civil servants about opening up that can of worms might be preventing people from doing some of this. So maybe there are new technologies that could be helping them to evaluate maybe some of the impact of their policies, but they're kind of fearful of having that conversation around using some of these new technologies. Is that, in your experience, something that's happening?
I mean, I think we need to put the guardrails in place, don't we, around AI, because in the private sector, it's an emerging market as well. I mean, I think, you know, if we were to look at the amount of startups that might have started today in AI, it's probably more than you might expect. So everyone is kind of on a bit of a learning curve with this, and I think we need to understand at a central level what the use cases are. Through which we can learn that we've got the right tool for the right job, and test out, you know, what's our appetite around kind of radical. So, for example, something that would be more within our human value, our human control, would be, you know, running our own data model on our own data. So we would understand, and we'd have the transparency around what is the information and the data sets that model has been trained on. The other kind of angle, the less kind of, I describe it as central, but the kind of more federated model is whereby we kind of open out, you know, the generative AI playground, and we get our analysts and our data engineers and software engineers working on GitHub, for example. I think that's really helpful. I think we should encourage the innovation there, encourage that human value from our own people to kind of work out what the art of the possible is. It's a slightly different approach to the kind of use case, large language model approach. But I think we probably need to give people a little bit more direction around how we want them to use that kind of generative AI playground. But yeah, the ethics are, we're still working through, I think, how do we demonstrate transparency, how do we bring the public trust along with us, because there is a definite trust gap, I'd say, at the moment.
I mean, anyone else feel free to jump in on the AI point, but I also, before we go to the audience, want to talk about this central government working with their delivery partners, because that's key to evaluating kind of ultimately the impact of your policies when they're delivered to citizens. So Richard, I'm going to come back to you on this. So you said that you're doing a lot of this because you have such a huge ecosystem of kind of delivery partners. What are the practical barriers that get in the way of sharing that kind of data?
Well, I think there's a mixture of, some of it's cultural, some of it's practical. I mean, the practical difficulties are, you know, pretty well rehearsed, I think, you know, trying to get multiple different IT systems to talk to each other. We've now stopped literally faxing data. You know, data transfer was for a while faxing data to another office, and so they have to code it in. So we are beyond that, I'm happy to say, but only just. So, look, I think a lot of this is down to relationships and trust between agencies. It's also down to having a dialogue around the way you understand sort of the rules of the road, I suppose. So we've touched on data ethics and also data protection. You know, different agencies across different parts of the public sector have very different understandings of what the rules are that apply to them, have different approaches to the way they go about data protection. So in our programs, we've set up quite a strong data ethics team which works with people across the different agencies. And we've got a strand of work which is looking with ONS as well, actually, at understanding the different ways in which people interpret the data protection standards that they have to apply, and what that means when you're transferring data between agencies. I think we've also done quite a lot to make sure that we are, when we are linking data. Actually, one of the big problems has been just the mechanics of linking data at scale. So I'm happy to say I've got some brilliant data scientists who work at MOJ who developed our own software for linking, really quickly, huge data sets. And this is one of the most downloaded open source bits of technology for linking data across the world, and Harvard are using it and contributing to its development because it's open source, so that's really good. So those technical aspects are really important, but we also need to make sure that, say, if an agency has challenges in sharing data, then maybe we're making data from other agencies available on their system rather than transferring the other way. So we're finding our way. I think the key thing to this really is it's sort of organic growth, because you can only go as fast as the trust and the relationships will allow you to. I think we've made a lot of progress across local agencies, working with the judiciary. We've managed to develop quite a broad alliance. But I think that the trust and culture issues are as important as the practical ones.
Thanks. Catherine, do you recognise that, the kind of trust and cultural issues, do you help when you're working with other departments? Do you help them on some of those issues? But also the thing about organic growth, have we got time to wait for organic growth? The world is moving so fast, technology is moving so fast, expectations are growing so quickly. Don't we have to speed up?
So I would say that one of the biggest barriers to evaluation is people's appetite to actually understand the impact of the thing they're working on. So, yeah, absolutely. So essentially, speed. So sometimes people don't bother because they think something's just got to happen, so we don't bother checking. Sometimes, genuinely, the appetite just isn't there. Or, as good civil servants, everyone truly, genuinely believes that the thing they're doing is going to make a difference. And the thought that it might not be, and you might want to check that, is abhorrent. You're like, well, why would you waste money that you could spend on delivering on checking? Because this thing is very obviously a very good thing. So absolutely, a lot of people could do much more, and culturally we don't, for a whole variety of reasons. How much I do to change that, I don't know, it's quite limited. It's both a carrot and a stick, isn't it? I think having a culture where failure and getting things wrong is accepted, because actually if you are checking, if you are, like, the ultimate thing is actually sometimes you'll find out things don't work, that you should stop doing them. And the appetite to have that information and do something on it is tricky. So yeah, that leads back to the systems thing, right? About how you structure it in so it doesn't feel like something you're doing out on a limb by yourself, but actually it's just part of a growth, part of something that you're trying out, new ways of working. And I think it was Sian actually that said that there was lots of stuff that we're doing now, but actually the legacy stuff we just accept that we've always done, and trying to move away from just looking at the new and the innovative, but actually taking a look back at the business as usual with fresh set of eyes is really important.
It's very interesting, that curiosity about whether that policy area that's kind of your baby, is it actually working? Do you want to know if it's actually working? But it might be that the data shows it's not working brilliantly, but if you tweak it a little bit, it could, so not just a case of you might want to stop that, it could help you actually improve what you're working on. Tuula and then Sian, any thoughts on this? How do you work with agencies that are delivering and get the data, share the data between central and local?
Well, in Finland, I take an example from my own project. The only possibility was like go to Parliament and make this solution in legislation, because it was very difficult to negotiate with the government departments about that. And now they have to put this minimal level data to the general data pool.
Yeah. So
And
having that legislative framework
Yes,
was a foundation that
yes.
you needed to have. Okay.
that we have to do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. Sian, anything?
So they've covered lots, but there's the data paradox that I think is useful to think about here, that you're relying on people who are part of the process to put the data into a system that you're then using to evaluate. So data quality is really important. Data standards, all the really boring stuff we've talked about all day, data quality, data standards, reference data, using the same reference data, all really important so that you actually can draw some conclusions and the incentives do not align. So quite often for things that aren't working, there isn't the incentive to put the data into the system to be able to quantify how little it's working, because that actually impacts the jobs of the people who need to put the data into the system in the first place. So I think thinking about the incentives and particularly that data paradox. I mean, it's really easy. You think about HR data, you don't put the HR data into your system right, which means that when you get your reports, you say your report's wrong and you expect HR to go and fix them. It's crazy, but that happens throughout all of the evaluation work we're talking about.
This incentives issue has come up quite a lot, I think, through all the sessions that we've had. Okay, time for questions from the audience. Anything? Yes, there's a lady here and then a gentleman here. So we'll take these two first, then we'll come down to Matthew. Matthew's going to be mischievous from the front row, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Kirsty. I work at Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And one thing that we sometimes struggle with is the sort of quantifying some of the intangible outcomes and also the longer term outcomes of things we're working on. You know, it's hard to measure a case of homelessness presented, or, you know, if we're talking about reoffending outcomes, you know, 5 years down the line, things like that, you know, within a spending cycle, it's very hard to quantify some of that. So I'd be interested in what the panel think about different data we can use to understand some of those harder to quantify things, or
Thanks.
prevention.
Thanks. That was Kirsty. A really good question about how do you actually, what type of data do you need, what type of data can you use for measuring really long-term outcomes like reoffending and housing. There was another question here.
Thank you. I just want to get back to like the question, which is kind of like the topical line on the slide for the entire session, getting data to drive value for government spend. The human element was kind of brought up by the panel, evaluation was brought up by the panel. Getting to a culture of checking what we're doing rather than just doing the doing came up. I was wondering, like, obviously if you're doing a project that's going quite successful, an area of spend that's quite successful, like the food standards example, it's probably quite easy to get all your co-workers in the room who might not be working on data to kind of agree to, oh, let's collect more data, let's collect everything, let's show everything, share everything, celebrate our success. However, if you kind of know that your area of government spend is going not so well maybe, or is running into difficulties, people might be more hesitant to collect that data, might say, let's collect less, let's maybe not talk about it so much, let's do the evaluation a little bit later. How do you bring people then onto that journey of making sure that we're kind of learning from our past policy iterations and making sure that we do better, not just 10 years from now, but next year?
Thanks. Another really good question. So easy maybe to get the data if it's going well, maybe not quite so good to get the data if maybe there's a sense it's not going so well. And I would throw in there, what role do ministers play in demanding data? So are there policy areas maybe where they maybe don't want to know, and some where they do? So those two questions, answer one or both. Sian, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, so we talked about longitudinal data in one of the sessions this morning, and I think we really need to think about government's longitudinal data in the short term, because it doesn't fit into ministerial cycles, but also how long is long term? I mean, we're looking at life course studies where the participants now are in their 60s and 70s. Those are really good studies. We need to be starting more of them. So in the future, we've got those too. I think we should have some basic data collection as well to answer your questions. So what is the department's accountability and what data should we expect to be collected? So even if there isn't data collection as part of projects, there is data that can look at the impact that that department is having. So it depends how meta you want to get, but I think there are data. The problem is government isn't very good at writing down what data it has. So I'm sure that most departments do have data to do those kinds of evaluations. Whether or not anybody knows all of them across all of the departments, I think that's probably part of the challenge, and that is being picked up by the centre.
And maybe that's a bit what Tuula was saying. It's not just incentivising, it's requiring people to have a certain amount of data open to share. Richard, come to you.
Great. Well, those are two great questions. I think, thinking about long-term and sort of, as it were, softer, harder to measure outcomes. I think we're lucky in the criminal justice system because we've got quite good data and stats on quite a lot of outcomes for offenders. So there's long-established data on reoffending and so on. We've tried to look at. One of the issues in looking at a range of different ways in which, say, you can deliver an outcome like crime is that you've got so many different kinds of intervention across different agencies. So, housing's part of it, target hardening's part of it, looking after victims is part of it, tackling reoffending behaviour is part of it. So we've tried to draw together a lot of the data on what those programmes have achieved in terms of sort of outputs, things they've done, and then used research to try to work out, well, what then happens next in terms of the behaviour or, say, the success of an individual in the labour market. And we've also got quite good data from the Home Office on the social and economic costs of crime. So you can work out what harm you're avoiding and how what's the effect of reintegrating people back into the labour market rather than committing crimes. What are the incentives to do this? I think at spending reviews there's quite a bit of scrutiny of what evidence we have now and its quality. I would say, with the things that Catherine and her brilliant team are doing in encouraging discipline across the system in terms of, things like, for most of our programs now across MOJ, we've got, what are they called? Outcome trees. Is that what they're called? Outcome trees. So, which the evaluation task force have been working with us on, which try to map out, from your spend, what are you doing with it? What effects is that having in an immediate sense? And then longer term, what's the evidence show on the impact it has for the economy and for society? I think if, your team, the Treasury, the Cabinet Office, keep asking us difficult questions, and you do it relentlessly, spending review by spending review, fiscal event by fiscal event, you get into a certain rhythm of discipline and an expectation that if you don't do this stuff, there'll be consequences. I should never mention the NAO in this context as well, but actually, the NAO giving us occasionally a bit of a hard time on this stuff is, it does actually make things better. So the kind of questions the NAO ask, anticipating that, goodness knows, some of those might come up at the PAC occasionally, it puts pressure on us, but I think it does make over time it improves the quality of our answers, and that's a really good thing.
Thanks, Richard. Tuula, one or both of those questions?
Yes. Well, a little different way to see it. I think that we still need researchers, and in Finland we have, from many phenomena, like much of knowledge. For instance, we are discussing about physical activity in daily life. I don't speak about sports. But do you sit down too much and that kind of thing? And it's in every media we have discussion. We have knowledge, we have metrics and everything. But let's see if we can change the movement, because it concerns each department in every in whole government. And I think that question is we have to have this research. And in your answer, I don't think that we shouldn't gain in public sector that we have knowledge of everything. We also have to explore and analyze researchers' knowledge.
From
But-
academia and from elsewhere.
Yes,
Yeah.
like that, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Tuula. Fiona.
Yeah, I mean, I think my point about data gaps. I mean, you have to be clear when you've got a gap, and you've hopefully got sufficient kind of empowerment within your role to come up with new methods which help address those gaps. I mean, Treasury guidance and books, they can be changed. I know they're not changed very often, but they often don't keep up necessarily with the times particularly well. But we need to get the right kind of infrastructure in place around data. So getting that infrastructure which is going to keep us is future-proof to help us answer the future questions for which we don't yet have answers for. And I think Alison will have mentioned the 3 L's around data, so linked, longitudinal and local. If we can get that right, then we've got the power to kind of unblock our knowledge and insights at a much greater level than what we've got at the moment. So, we need to recognise that the infrastructure is critical, and that we should build out data assets which we can use time and time again.
And I think the challenge is a lot of people here obviously will understand the value of that. It's what we've been talking about. It's making sure that leaders in the civil service understand the value of that, and that the investment goes into that kind of work as well. Catherine, is it right? You're just going to make everybody do this anyway, aren't you? Really?
Pretty much, yeah. So just some very, very practical, I feel like I want to very practically help both of you. So on your example of you can't intangibles, don't ever try to solve an analytical data problem on your own. So there will be someone out there who has done this somewhere else in government. Use your analysts, use other departments, use people, use the evaluation task forces, evaluation trials advice panel. Come along, let us help you, because there will have been an evaluation in that before. I can remember I have done some horrific evaluations into things like what is the global impact of Brexit on the UK's influence and soft power, and I'm like, I don't know, but I'm not going to solve that on my own. So absolutely, there are things that you can do to get other people to do that. On the was
that an area where ministers didn't want to know the answer?
I think they wanted to know an answer, but that leads to the second question: what do you do when people just aren't motivated to do it? Carrot and stick. So basically, evaluation task force. When I first joined, I think 3 departments had evaluation strategies, publicly available strategies, saying what is their intention to evaluate, what are they interested in. Now all but 1 do. And so if you can change the broader culture, the broader systems and structures, you go some way, you still get resistance, you still get people who aren't quite that interested. Find the bit that interests them. So there's always something, whether it's that they want to, I don't know, improve the process because of the ministers always want something about efficiency, or they're interested in something else. There's always an angle to the way, because actually evaluation could just be seen as we're going to find your thing doesn't work and we're going to say no, or it could be we want to make your thing work the best possible way. Let's test out variations of it. So I'm not going to say it doesn't work, I'm going to say which version of the thing works better. So there's almost always an angle, there's almost always a way. So from the big system structures to us imposing settlement conditions, or us doing things where we're trying to help others with the advisory panel, there's always a route in.
I'm going to come out for a couple more questions, but Richard, you wanted to come
just
back
quickly,
in.
you also at ministers as well. I mean, ministers, in my experience, are really focused on what the data are telling them. I mean, they're having to take really difficult decisions, often very quickly. They've got many more proposals for spending than they've got any hope of getting money. So they're having to make difficult trade-offs, and they are often very, very focused on getting the data to understand, to inform their choice. And they kind of understand that this will often play out in public. So they're trying to think, well, how will the data tell our story? And they're also focusing on how current services are delivering. So there's the immediate. There's also, they're also thinking about their legacy, right? So they don't want after a few years something to come along and say, well, that landmark program you had turns out not to be as effective as you were claiming. So they will challenge this stuff and they will scrutinise it. And they have themselves created an
And quite
expectation
rightly,
of
they want the
transparency.
best quality data possible.
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay, so Matthew had a question here. Does anyone else? And we'll go there, and then I think let's take 3, but you'll have to be quick, all right? And just choose maybe one of them. So Matthew, the gentleman from Wandsworth, and then the gentleman on the end there. Matthew, do we have another microphone? Why don't you do yours first, doesn't matter what order.
Hi, Salman Kalar from Richmond Council and Wandsworth Councils, 2 councils.
Two. Okay.
So just to say, I think one of the things is value for who? So who are we just talking about value for government spending, or are we talking about value for the resident? Are we talking about the value for the person directly working with that resident? Collecting data, especially for evaluations, is annoying for the front line and the customer. So you have to demonstrate direct value to them also when you've done your evaluations. If they're giving the ethnicity data, if they're giving their data on their equalities, how have you used to improve equalities? So I think that's one of the things that has to clearly be demonstrated when we do that. And I think broader concept of value.
Yeah, so we're asking people to give their data, so who are we actually looking at measuring? We do have 2 sessions coming up that are on citizen-centred kind of delivery and improving policymakers, so that might come up in that as well. We've got a question there where you've got the mic, and then a question, could you bring the mic to Matthew here as well? So gentleman there, if you're...
I wanted to pick up on something from the previous session, which was one of the panelists spoke about how a big loss of value is in departments procuring the same data over and over. And I wanted to ask, do you think there's a need for departments to more centrally plan the kind of data that they'll need over the year, or kind of centralize those projects so that they know both what data has been previously acquired, what they're going to need, and where they can share that across the different projects if there are lots of overlapping data sources?
Thank you. Really good question. I think this touches a bit on what you said at the beginning about knowing what data you're going to need to know. So should we plan more about what data we're going to need? And then Matthew, your question.
Right, yes, thanks. So Matthew from the NAO. So just looking for top tips from the panel on how you identify and overcome some of the barriers. So for example, bias or urgency or commercial sensitivity. I mean, what sort of ideas have you seen where you could just get over those challenges in getting the data?
Brilliant. So question from Matthew is top tips on overcoming some of the barriers that we've all talked about. Should we plan more, be more strategic in the data that we're going to need across government? And then whose value, what value? Are we talking about value for citizens or value for the public? Sian, we haven't heard from you for a while, so you can probably just choose.
I'm going to pick Matthew's because it's nice and easy. So I think it's about taking opportunities here, right? So the work of the evaluation task force means that it's quite hard for us to get a sample plan so that we can do the quantitative analysis to see whether our programs are working. And that's had a really odd unintended consequence of getting those teams who are normally really hard to engage with to come and talk to my team and to improve the data quality, because all of a sudden they know that to get future funding they need to have the evaluation, which is improving the data quality. So sometimes the opportunities come from really weird angles, and it's about taking those opportunities, however strange they seem, to improve the things that we've heard a lot about today, so data quality, reference data, data standards, all of the things that are the bread and butter of the data folk in departments, because if we can improve those when there's the opportunity to, when we need the improved version, it's there to use.
Great, so seizing those opportunities. Richard, any of those questions?
Can I ask a question about, I mean, it's public value, basically, isn't it? And value for citizens and residents. I mean, the Green Book gets a bit of stick, and it's had a bit on this panel, which I'm shocked at, obviously. But the sort of Green Book and the evaluation methodologies that we use to try really hard, actually, on the evidence to get to a sense of what makes people better off. Whether that's the delivery of an individual service that you can see the people benefiting from it, you can see who uses it, but you can also see to some degree what the spillovers are. So, maybe if it's improving the local environment, well, what effect does that have on people's health, people's ability to enjoy the place they're living in? But right through to really big macro stuff, like Sian and I used to work at the Department for International Trade, and we were looking at the impacts of trade negotiations. And all the time you're trying to think, not just which business is going to get which deal. That's not really it. What you're trying to think through is what does this do to the economy's ability to boost individuals' prosperity? What kind of jobs could people do that might pay them better? So you are constantly thinking, how's this going to make individuals better off? And kind of what's their experience? What does that look like? So this is quite a broad set of measures that we're trying to use. We don't always get it right. We're constantly trying to improve them. But with the Green Book guidance and the way we go about it, it's pretty, it's published so that it can be challenged.
Thanks. Tuula, which question would you like to?
The first one also. Finnish government made a research this year about the citizens' experience and customers' experience in public sector, and there are lots of knowledge or evidence asking, what do you feel about these public services and so on. It's a lot of knowledge there and data, but the problem is that it's so different system, metrics, everything, and the one recommendation was that should it be like main questions in like everybody ask, and then extra questions also. It's very interesting.
So again, it's about gathering lots of information, but how do you standardise that in a way then that the policymakers can use that?
I don't know.
We'll definitely pick that up in the session on citizen-centred services after lunch. Your thoughts, Fiona?
So I might try and skim across all three. So
you've got minus 30 seconds to skim across all three.
So at the moment, it's getting the contract in place for mobility data, for example, whereby it can be used by other parties across government. So you don't go in narrow, you go in wide, and then you have to agree that up front. I think there's something about developing relationship more with citizens these days, so that there is that trust there. I think the banks do it very well with data. You tend to trust your bank. You have a long-term relationship with them. Is there more opportunity for government to operate like that? And then on the challenges, I think data stewardship, we should look at reducing some of the delays around data sharing, and there are proposals around streamlining some of the stewardship proposals that I'm very happy to talk to you about afterwards.
Thanks, Matthew. That's an offer to you for the lunch break. And I'm going to give the final word to you, Catherine.
Sure, okay, I'll bang out the answers then. So yeah, absolutely. Why wouldn't we want to plan better use of data across? I think we should get the basics of government delivery right, and I think we should do a better job at doing those basics better. Public-centred stuff, obviously, I think Tinkerbell said that whenever someone said fairies don't exist, one dies. I feel like when someone tells me about some awful data collection, part of my heart dies. Yes, I agree, we should not collect awful data. And absolutely, we shouldn't be evaluating it and ignoring entire groups of people. Totally agree with you. And in terms of making things better, and I think you mentioned actually when you were on stage before the procurement bill, hopefully the task force is helping to inform, to make evaluation part of guidance into that procurement bill. I think there's all sorts of different ways that you can tweak existing processes without reinventing the wheel to make them better.
I love that we've ended on a Tinkerbell note. I think that's really good. Thank you so much. Thank you again to the audience for all of your questions. Thank you to our wonderful panel, to Catherine, to Fiona, Tuula, Richard and Sian. Thank you so much for all of your time.